When most people hear the name Sodom, they think of only one thing: destruction, fire, sulfur, ruins. Did you know that before all of this, Sodom was one of the most envied cities in the entire region? A metropolis with centuries of history, walls that impressed visitors, thriving commerce, palaces, full granaries, and a population that had called that place home for generations? And archaeology has confirmed all of this? The story of Sodom that most people know begins in Genesis chapter 19, at the time of the end. But the city existed long before that. It had been built stone by stone, generation after generation. It had children in the streets, merchants at the gates, farmers in the fields, and a daily life that lasted for centuries, until the day it stopped. And what archaeologists have found at the site, identified as the likely location of Sodom, is, in my opinion, one of the most extraordinary stories that biblical archaeology has ever revealed. Not because of the destruction itself, but because of the contrast between what existed before and the absolute silence that followed. Today I'm going to take you inside Sodom, not to the end, but to the beginning, to the city that existed before everything else. For centuries, the location of Sodom has been one of the greatest debates in biblical archaeology. Scholars have proposed dozens of different locations. Some thought the city was submerged beneath the waters of the Dead Sea. Others placed it on the southern shores of the same sea. There were theories on all sides. In 2005, an American archaeologist named Stephen Collins began excavations at a site in what is now Jordan, on the banks of the Jordan River, called Tal el-Hammam. What he found completely changed the debate. It's important to make it clear. The identification of Tal el-Hammam as biblical Sodom is the hypothesis defended by Collins and a growing number of archaeologists, but it is not an academic consensus. Other scholars propose different locations. What is not in dispute is what was found at the site. And what was found is extraordinary regardless of any biblical identification. Tal el-Hammam was a huge city, with walls, with a palace, with layers upon layers of human occupation accumulated over centuries, and with a geographical location that remarkably matched the biblical description of the plain of the Jordan where Sodom was situated. But what sealed the argument was a specific layer in the excavations. At a certain depth, the excavation uncovered something that shouldn't have been there. A layer of destruction with physical characteristics that archaeologists had never seen at any other site in the region. A layer that, in archaeological terms, indicated that something extraordinary had happened in that place. But I'll get there. First, I need to show you what existed before this layer, because destruction only has weight when you understand what was destroyed. As the excavations at Tal el-Hammam progressed, what was revealed was not a village, it was a metropolis. According to excavation reports by Stephen Collins, the urban area of Tal el-Hammam covered approximately 36 hectares, the equivalent of more than 50 football fields. For the Middle Bronze Age, around 1800 to 1650 BC, this was extraordinary. Collins describes the site as the largest city in the Jordan Valley region during that period, a claim that other researchers generally do not dispute regarding the size of the site, even if they disagree with the biblical identification. The walls surrounding the city were several meters thick at the base. They were built to last, and they did. Excavations have revealed multiple phases of construction and reinforcement of the walls over the centuries, meaning that generation after generation invested in the defense and maintenance of the city. Within the walls, there was a palace, or at least a large structure that served as an administrative center. There were residential areas. There were large-scale storage spaces, indicating an economy that produced enough surplus to save for hard times. This was not an improvised city. It was the result of centuries of deliberate construction, of decisions made by generations who wanted to leave something solid for their children. And there was a very concrete reason for all this prosperity. The Bible offers a clue that, when read carefully, makes perfect sense in light of archaeology. Genesis 13 verse 10 describes Abraham and his nephew Lot looking toward the plain of the Jordan, the region where Sodom was located, and the text uses a specific expression. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Two of the most powerful references to fertility that a writer from the ancient world could use. Egypt was synonymous with abundance in the ancient world. The Nile fertilized its fields annually. Comparing the Jordan Plain to Egypt was no ordinary compliment. It meant acknowledging that the region was among the most productive in the known world. And archaeology confirms this. The Jordan Valley at that time had access to abundant river water, fertile soil in the floodplains, and a climate that allowed for large-scale agriculture. Sodom and the surrounding cities controlled this region. But there was more. The Dead Sea, which lay nearby, was a source of valuable mineral resources in the ancient world. Bitumen, sulfur, salts, and other minerals were extracted and traded in the region. Control of the routes between the Jordan Valley and the surrounding civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Canaan, placed Sodom at the center of a strategic trade corridor. A city that controls fertile land, access to mineral resources, and trade routes needs little explanation to be prosperous. Sodom was rich because it was in the right place. And for centuries, it knew how to take advantage of that. What do the excavations reveal about who the people who lived in Sodom were? In the Middle Bronze Age dwellings at Tal el-Hammam, archaeologists have found sophisticated pottery, high-quality vessels, pots, and jars that indicate not only functionality, but also aesthetic care. Bronze tools, simple jewelry, balance weights used in trade. Animal bones found at domestic sites show that the diet was varied: cattle, sheep, goats, and evidence of grain and legume consumption. It was not the diet of a starving people. It was the diet of a reasonably well-nourished population. Religious practices were present. Small votive figures and objects associated with rituals were found, consistent with the religious practices of Near Eastern cultures during that period. And there was trade. Balance weights, small, standardized objects used to measure goods, indicate an economy monetized enough to require measuring instruments. This means transactions, markets, negotiation. The people who lived in Sodom had names. They had families. They had neighbors. They woke up in the morning, worked their fields or their trades, traded in the market near the city gate, and returned home at night. They were people. And the Bible, interestingly, preserves a detail about this city that many hasty readings completely miss. Genesis 13 describes a scene that is far more revealing than it appears at first glance. Abraham and his nephew Lot had such large flocks that the land where they were could not support both of them together. There were conflicts between their respective shepherds, and Abraham proposed a generous solution: that Lot would first choose the region where he wanted to live, and Abraham would keep what remained. Lot looked toward the plain of the Jordan, the region of Sodom, and chose. The text says that he lifted up his eyes and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered. And he chose that region because it was the most prosperous in sight. This was not a spiritual decision.
It was a rational economic decision. A man looked at two options and chose the most profitable one. And what's fascinating is that archaeology confirms he made the right choice from an economic standpoint. The Jordan Plain was indeed the most fertile and richest region in the area. Tal el-Hammam, Sodom, was in fact the larger and more prosperous city. Lot didn't choose Sodom out of naivete.
He knew what he was doing. And the biblical text then records an important detail. The inhabitants of Sodom were wicked and sinned greatly against the Lord. Prosperity and problems coexisted. The city was real, it was rich, and it had its own problems, like any real city. But keep this detail in mind, because there's another scene in Sodom that reveals a lot about how the city functioned socially, and that only makes sense when you understand the archaeological context of what that city was like. Genesis 18 and 19 describe the arrival of visitors, identified in the text as angels, to the city of Sodom. There's a detail in this narrative that most people overlook, but it's archaeologically significant. The text says that Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. In the world of ancient Near Eastern cities, sitting outside the city was not a casual gesture. The gate, the entrance, was the center of the city's public life. It was where leaders met, where deals were closed, where conflicts were judged. Sitting outside the city indicated a position of leadership, or at least social importance. Lot, a foreigner who had chosen to live in Sodom, had established himself sufficiently to occupy that position. The narrative also reveals that Lot was aware of the culture of hospitality. He insisted that the visitors stay in his house, not in the public square. Hospitality was a serious social obligation in the ancient Near East. Receiving strangers was a moral duty, and Lot took it seriously. And the city square existed. The text explicitly mentions that there was a public square in Sodom, where visitors could spend the night. This is consistent with the archaeology of Middle Bronze Age cities, which had public spaces, monumental gates, and meeting squares. Sodom had a real urban structure. It wasn't a camp, it was a city with all the characteristics of social organization that this implies. If you've made it this far and this type of content resonates with you, biblical archaeology with real depth, verifiable historical facts, stories most people have never heard before, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. There's new content like this every week. The button is below. Now, let's continue, because what comes next is the most impactful part of this entire video. In 2021, a study published in the journal Scientific Reports, one of the world's most respected scientific journals, presented the results of 15 years of analysis of the physical evidence found in Tal el-Hammam. What the scientists described was unlike anything ever found at another archaeological site in the region. In a specific layer, corresponding to the Middle Bronze Age, when Sodom would have been at the height of its prosperity, researchers found evidence of extreme temperatures. Fragments of pottery with a vitrified surface, transformed into glass by heat. Grains of molten zirconium, which only forms above 1650 degrees Celsius. Fragments of quartz with shock marks that are normally associated with high energy impacts. For reference, the maximum temperature of a typical wildfire rarely exceeds 600 degrees Celsius. The temperature of an active volcano is around 700 to 1200 degrees. What was found at Tal el-Hammam requires a heat source far beyond what any ordinary terrestrial explanation can provide. The researchers also found a salt-rich layer, consistent with the destruction of agricultural soil
and fragments of pulverized human bones mixed with the rubble in a way that indicates instantaneous death and total destruction of the structures above them.
The scientific hypothesis that the study presents as the most consistent with all this evidence combined is that of an impact event or aerial explosion of a celestial body, a meteor or comet that would have exploded in the atmosphere above the region, releasing energy at temperatures that no ordinary terrestrial cause can explain. It's important to state clearly, this is a scientific hypothesis, the explanation that best fits the physical evidence found, according to the study's authors. It is not a proven fact. Other researchers may propose different explanations as more data is analyzed. But what is not a hypothesis is the physical evidence itself. The impact glass, the fused zirconium, the pulverized bones, these are there, and they have no simple explanation. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't a war. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something the inhabitants of that city had never seen before. And if the hypothesis is correct, they didn't have time to see it. Here is the fact that, in my opinion, is the most impactful of this whole story. After the layer of destruction, Tal el-Hammam became uninhabited. Not for a generation, not for a few decades, for a period estimated at several hundred years. Collins's reports point to something around 700 years of occupation gap, based on the site's stratigraphy. This is an estimate based on archaeological layers, not a precise number, but the magnitude of the abandonment is not in doubt. A city that had been continuously occupied for centuries, with walls that were reinforced generation after generation, with a palace, with a thriving economy, with thousands of inhabitants, simply ceased to exist. In archaeology, when a city is destroyed but remains habitable, people return. They rebuild. They take advantage of the foundations that already exist. The history of ancient cities is a history of destruction and reconstruction in layers. That's precisely what makes excavations possible. But at Tal el-Hammam, there is no layer of reconstruction over the Middle Bronze Age ruins. The site was only reoccupied much later, centuries later, when those who returned had no memory of what had existed there. The abandonment is documented. It's stratigraphic. It's in the layers of the earth, not just in texts. And this is consistent, disturbingly so, with what the Bible describes. Genesis chapter 19, verse 25 says that God overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. The text doesn't describe a destruction from which people recover, it describes an end. And archaeology found exactly that, an end. There is a verse about Sodom that most people have never read. It's not in Genesis, it's in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 49. And it completely changes the way the story of Sodom is normally told. Ezekiel writes, in the voice of God, the following words about Sodom. "This is the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud, with plenty of food and leisure, but they did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." Pride, excess, and indifference to the poor. This does not negate the other elements of the Genesis narrative. The biblical text presents multiple dimensions of the problem of Sodom. But Ezekiel chose to highlight this specific aspect, a city that had everything, prosperity, food, free time, and used it all for itself, ignoring those who had nothing. A prosperous city that closed itself off from its own wealth.
And when you look at what archaeology has revealed about Sodom, the fertility of the region, the full granaries, the active trade, Ezekiel's diagnosis makes historical sense. Sodom had resources to spare. The question was what it did with them.
This detail transforms Sodom from a distant symbol of ancient sin into something much closer and more recognizable. Let's pause and look at the bigger picture. A city built over centuries, walls raised generation after generation, fertile fields, thriving commerce, full granaries. A regional metropolis that attracted people from all over the area, like Lot, who chose it because it was the most prosperous in sight. And then, in a single moment, it was all over. Not gradually, not with time for reconstruction, with an end so complete that the city remained abandoned for 700 years, and the physical evidence of that end is still there in the ground, waiting for archaeologists to find it 3,000 years later. But the lesson this story carries goes beyond archaeology and beyond theology. Ezekiel identified Sodom's problem not only as immorality, but as prosperity disconnected from responsibility. A city that had everything and used it all for itself, that had plenty of bread and abundance of leisure, and did not use any of it to strengthen those in need. This is not a description of a distant city from 3,000 years ago. It's a description that anyone, at any time, can recognize, in systems, in communities, sometimes in themselves. The practical lesson I want you to take away from here is simple. Prosperity is not the problem. Excess is not necessarily the problem. The problem that Ezekiel pointed out, and that archaeology now shows was real in a real city, is what you do with what you have. A city with everything can come to a complete end, but a person with very little, who uses what little they have generously, builds something that lasts. This is what Sodom has to say to you today. If you've made it this far, I have a request. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week there's content like this. Biblical archaeology with real depth. Verifiable historical facts. Stories that most people know superficially, but that have a depth that few have explored. I don't want you to miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the end. Until the next video.